Are you an aspiring solutions architect? In this video, I'm going to take you through AWS Solutions Architect one-on-one, perfecting the customer meeting. What you're about to see is going to be a mock customer meeting with a fictional company named Any Company. I'm going to take you through the whole process where I'm role playing as the AWS Solutions Architect, and I'm talking with fictional customers from Any Company. I'm going to take you through the whole process from end to end, starting with the introductions. We're going to go over the agenda. We're going to define and review the customer's current challenges. We're going to go over the desired business outcomes. Then I'm going to go over the respective AWS technologies. In this case, it's going to be a generative AI use case. So you're going to want to pay particularly close attention. You're going to watch me earn trust and build technical credibility as I map the customer's business use case and their desired outcomes with the technologies that I'm walking them through. In addition to that, I'm also going to be walking the customer through a long-term vision in terms of not only will we build a prototype here now, but looking to the future in terms of different AWS services that we can leverage as we take the prototype to production. Now, in 3, 2, 1, here's the meeting. Good afternoon. I'd like to quickly introduce myself to you all because I've never met you before, so it's a pleasure to meet you. I am Greg Powell. I'm a senior solutions architect here at AWS. I am a member of the startup team, and I've been at AWS for just over 8 years now. I've been a member of our startup team since its inception in 2020, and it's an absolute pleasure to meet you today. And I'm definitely looking forward to learning more about what Any Company is doing. And I had a pleasure of meeting some of your extended team members last week. I believe we have collected a use case. So I will turn it over to you both for a round of introductions. Excellent. Nice to meet you. Thank you. We'll go ahead and dive into presentation here now. Okay, so for our agenda today, I'd like to first recap the use case and business outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, I did have an opportunity to meet with some of your extended team on the engineering side last week, and I've collected some details there, so we'll recap that. Also, in our sync last week, we did briefly touch on generative AI in general as it stands on AWS, but in this meeting, I'd like to go a notch deeper, but take into consideration the context of the use case. Also, I've planned a short demo like to familiarize you with Bedrock in particular, as I have identified that for our use case, at least for our prototype, as a nice next step. So I'll get you comfortable with Bedrock there a little bit. And I've even taken the liberty to go ahead and draft out a target state architecture, which I'll think that you all will like, that we'll talk about briefly. And then we'll end the meeting with next steps. How does that sound for an agenda today? All right, so step one, before we get into the nuts and bolts, before any lines of code is written, before we start talking about which generative AI service on AWS we should use, step one is define the business use case. I've been working with customers since 2023 when generative AI hit the market, and there was a lot of excitement, and so much excitement that there were a lot of initial knee-jerk reactions with some of my startup customers really racing to get something out there as quickly as possible. Sometimes we got to slow down before we go fast. And step one is really to define the business use case. And once we've defined it, to really look at, okay, what is the right tool for the right job? In this case, which is the right set of AWS services to solve the business use case and ultimately deliver the business outcomes that any company wants to achieve. In talking with your team last week, I am very confident that generative AI is definitely a great solution there. In terms of the use case, I have taken note of some of the current challenges. And currently, any company has no current defined way to gain insights on customer reviews. You are collecting the reviews. Your customers that use your platform can go in, and their teams, whether they be marketing or product management, can go in and read the reviews manually to collect customer feedback, but it's very laborious, it's very manual, and there's no automated mechanism to gain any insight on that or be able to take any actionable steps on that feedback. And my understanding is some of your customers that use the platform have hundreds and hundreds of reviews, and reviews are coming in all the time. Without an established customer feedback loop, your customers are having difficulty, in particular marketing efforts as well as product management, to be able to actively get a temperature of what's going on with their customers and to figure out not only how they can react to fix a problem, but how they can look at feedback and proactively get out in front of it before there is a problem, and even launch in potentially new products. And product sales have also taken a bit of a hit for some of the products where customer satisfaction is poor, but there's so many reviews and people's ability to be able to gain insights on that is largely a manual effort. Now, today, my understanding is that the business outcomes would be, we want to take the reviews that we're collecting, and speaking with some of your data analysts next week, my understanding is these can be easily exported via JSON, which I've confirmed, and that's great news because that's going to work nicely with what I have planned for it. We want to be able to analyze those business reviews for key insights. Now, if you've been using generative AI for a while, you might have, when you think of reviews, you think, okay, we can get all these reviews, we can process them, we can summarize them. Great, right? This prototype that I'm thinking about will go far beyond just summarizing the reviews, and we're going to get a lot more sentiment analysis as well as actionable next steps. Each product that we analyze in this prototype will create an executive review summary of a product, for example. So if it's a spicy chicken sandwich, or if it's a mountain bike, or if it's a blender, it would ingest however many reviews it is, and it would come up with an executive review that basically is a summation taking into consideration all the reviews that have been written. They talk about pros and cons and what customers like and what they don't like at a high level. We're also going to be looking at a sentiment breakdown. So it's going to be a mixture of positive reviews, the negative reviews, and what I call mixed, which sometimes is also referred as to neutral. And then really the thing that I think the team is really going to like is that after we've done this as a part of this analysis, we're going to include actions to remedy product challenges through a continuous improvement loop. Now I'll pause there for a minute to see if there are any questions so far. All right, now as we dig into this, we've already established that defining that business use case is the first step, and then determining what's the right tool for the right job. So in working with your team last week and collecting some feedback from the team, we've done our due diligence, and I strongly believe that generative AI on AWS is the right next step. Now this begs some additional questions, which a lot of my customers ask when they're at the very beginning of their generative AI journey. A lot of questions I get are things like, which model should I choose? So the model in terms of which large language model would we choose, because large language models are what is basically the magic that happens behind the scenes that makes all this work. How can we move quickly? Because a lot of my customers, and I'm sure any company, my understanding is your team is fairly new to generative AI. How can you move quickly? And then as we're moving quickly, how can we make sure that our data is secure and private? Good news is, as your dedicated AWS Solutions Architect, I'm going to help you navigate all of these things and help you figure out which model you choose, help you move quickly, and also make sure that your team is enabled with what best practices look like from a data security and privacy standpoint as you build this out. And I'd like to make today's session interactive. Definitely stop me if you have any questions as I'm going through the presentation here. If I know I have some slides coming up on your question, I may say, if you give me a moment, I'll answer your question in more depth as we hit a slide. If I don't have a slide about what you're asking, we can expand on it there in real time. So that'll be the pacing there. But this is what we call our generative AI stack. And I'm going to walk you through not only what this is, but why it's important to understand. And I'm going to see if I can get slightly fancy here. Not sure it's going to work. See if I can annotate this a little bit so you can see this. So starting here at the bottom with is infrastructure for foundational model training and inference. At this level, what you'll typically see are companies that want to build their own foundation models, their own large language models. They're working at the hardware level, so there are very few degrees of abstraction between the hardware and what they're building. Here we have illustrated Trainium and Inferentia. This highlights some of AWS's custom silicon. Trainium is infrastructure that's optimized for training jobs, and Inferentia is custom silicon that's optimized for inference jobs. Now, we also have SageMaker, which is a full-featured platform. One thing I would highlight is the SageMaker Jumpstart. And what this would allow you to do would be to host your own open source LLMs on your own infrastructure. And SageMaker basically helps you stand up an ML pipeline like the build, test, and deploy. Now, at this infrastructure level for foundation training and inference, typically, not always, the costs at this level tend to be a little bit higher because you are training models yourself. You're having to stand up very beefy infrastructure with lots of GPU, and there's a cost that you have to bear there. The good news is, as we work our way up the stack with the tools to build with LLMs and other foundation models, now at this layer, in the kind of the middle of the stack, instead of you building your own foundation model and an LLM, now you are consuming third-party models or the option to consume Amazon Titan models. So I'll walk you through this. This is the layer where Amazon Bedrock lives. And this is what I have identified with your team to conduct the proof of concept on. And I'll explain a little bit more about why we selected Bedrock here, and probably when I get to the architecture slides. But what Bedrock is, it will allow your team to build generative AI applications. It gives your team a single API endpoint. And behind that API endpoint is a nice collection of LLMs that you can choose from a wide variety of LLM providers. I have a slide coming up that will depict the selection, which I'll expand on who we have there. And within the Amazon Bedrock service, in addition to just the LLM, AWS is building a host of features around the LLMs that are being hosted behind the APIs themselves. We have things like guardrails, for example. I know we're at the starting edge of this use case now. We're trying to just kind of testing the waters and testing the technical feasibility of whether or not, how this will look, the use case will look on AWS. But once we start thinking about getting towards production, services like guardrails will help us address concepts like responsible AI. Because LLMs, they're trained on a massive amount of internet scale data. And our LLM companies have done a reasonably good job of tuning the models to make sure they're safe, but they're not necessarily 100% with hallucinations and things like that. So sometimes they can return things that you might not have prompted them. Guardrails will allow you to make sure that the responses that are being returned from the prompts that you're entering are what you would expect. We also have Amazon Bedrock agents, which it's nice to be able to issue a prompt towards an LLM and get a response. But let's say, for example, you wanted to write something in a DynamoDB database, or you wanted to take that prompt that you have issued and you wanted to enrich that prompt maybe with some artifacts that you've stored in another data store, like S3, for example, before you sent that to the Bedrock endpoint. Agents will be great at handling those multi-step workflows. For customers that find that their use case requires fine-tuning, we do have the ability to fine-tune on Amazon Bedrock for a selection of some of the LLMs that are provided. The good news for our use case here, based on the initial testing I've done, I've achieved very great results with the review analysis and sentiment analysis just by issuing a prompt template, which we'll learn more about that in the prototype in the coming days. And the other cool thing that I'll highlight here at this level are knowledge bases. I've hinted at that a little bit earlier when I was talking about agents, but as I indicated earlier, LLMs are trained on a huge amount of internet scale data, but they're not trained on necessarily your data or your domain knowledge that you have collected. So knowledge bases would allow you to stand up what's called a vector database. One of the common ones is OpenSearch serverless. And then you would be able to point to a corpus of data, for example, on S3, where you could host some of your documents and artifacts that you've collected over the years. And now when you're issuing prompts, if it makes sense, that data would be included in that, enriched in that prompt so that your customers can get very tailored information there. Amazon Q here is at the top level, and this is think pure API. So you don't have to tune anything. This is the easy button. So with the easy button, you can get started very quickly, but with the easy button, not as much granularity and customization as you would see with Amazon Bedrock or at the infrastructure level, but definitely for specific use cases, it works great. One of the things that eventually I would like to speak with your dev team with would be Amazon Q Developer, because this can supercharge your developers, dev team's productivity by baking in an AI coding companion in their favorite IDE. Now, this is a nice chart because it lines up very nice with kind of what we just talked about in terms of complexity. So at the very bottom of the, I'll say, y-axis is prompt engineering. When you are working with an LLM, the very essential thing that you need to do to interact with it is issue a prompt. And there are various techniques with prompt engineering that you can do that yield different results. So typically the way I describe prompt engineering is if I knew somebody that was very smart there and they had all the knowledge of the subject matter that I wanted to ask them about, the quality of their response is probably going to be influenced by the quality of my question. And the same kind of holds true with prompt engineering. If I asked a very simple question like, I don't know, which state should I live in? Then an LLM would respond back with a wide variety of interesting things. But if I ask the LLM, what state should I live in? And keep in mind, I like warm temperatures during the winter. I want to be in North America. If I give it more context, then my response is better. And that's essentially what prompt engineering is. Zero shot prompt engineering is just asking a specific question. Few shot, which is what I've indicated earlier, is where you not only ask a question, but you give it some additional context or potentially some examples. And in the prototype, I focused a lot on prompt engineering and prompt templates to yield the best results for our prototype that will be coming up. Going up the stack here, we have retrieval augmented generation, which sounds fancy, but it's a lot easier than you would think. It's commonly abbreviated as RAG, and I touched on this in the previous slide. This would basically be where you would issue a prompt, and if the question in the prompt needs to have some context about data that is outside of the scope of the LLM, you could actually hook into your own data that you have through a knowledge base, and this is how that works. Now, there is some additional complexity here, although with Amazon Bedrock knowledge bases, it's a lot easier because all this is managed in Bedrock. You would expect, because you're running some additional infrastructure, namely the vector database, that the cost would be a little bit more because you're running an open search serverless vector store. And I'm throwing a lot of terms out there. What a vector store is essentially when you want to make a retrieval augmented generation use case work, for example, a knowledge base where you ask a question and then it parses through your data set to give you a question and leverage the LLM as well. You have to use an embeddings model to be able to scan through your corpus of documents, and then those embeddings are stored in a vector store. And then those vectors are used to enrich your prompts, and it just helps make the magic happen. And it's the connective tissue that makes that knowledge base work in the LLM. Going up the notch a little bit more, model customization. This is where we would be doing things like fine tuning, as I mentioned on a previous slide. And fine tuning is where you would provide the LLM that you would choose with labeled data to be able to train it and do some domain adaptation there. And then at the very top of the complexity chart would be pre-training a model or building a model or retraining a model from scratch. And that would be the heaviest lift. For this use case, we've identified that the prompt engineering is going to work ideally, but in the future, as we think of new use cases, we do have these other options that we can work with you on there. All right, so just a quick recap here. Some of these things I've mentioned. Amazon Bedrock is going to give you a choice of leading FMs through a single API. You do have that opportunity to do model customization on some LLMs for use cases that warrant it. The retrieval augmented generation is built in right out of the box through Bedrock knowledge bases. The agents, as a recap, will allow you to run multi-step task, which comes in super handy. And then security, privacy, and data governance is also built in. And I know we had a question on that earlier, which I believe comes up here after this slide. So real quick, we have a broad choice of models. So another nice thing that is great about Amazon Bedrock is that the LLMs come to you versus you going to the LLMs. So instead of having to go through different APIs and hit those outside of AWS, now the LLMs are within AWS and you can hit them directly from there, from your environment where your data lives. I'll be leveraging Anthropic Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which I've had great results with that, which you'll take a closer look at on Friday. None of any company's data will be used to train the underlying model. All the data that is transmitted will be encrypted, both in transit and at rest. And the data used for customization, which in this case, if you were to fine tune a model, which we won't be, will be securely transferred through any company's VPC. And the data will remain in the region where your API is processed. And then if you have any compliance requirements, GDPR, SOC, ISO, CSA compliance, and HIPAA eligibility are all possibilities. We're going to talk more about pricing on Friday, but there are 3 different ways to consume Bedrock. The way in which the proof of concept will consume it is on demand. So it's pay as you go, no commitment, and the pricing will be based on input and output tokens. I know cost, I wrote down a note, was a little bit of a question earlier. So it's input, output tokens. In terms of what that looks like, the good news is we won't have to guess, because I'll show you on Friday as we issue prompts and as we watch this prototype working, we'll be able to see what the input and output tokens look like. And then when we run this thing at scale, I'd have to work with your team to determine the volume in which you think that you would hit Bedrock, and then we can talk about the pricing there. Provision throughput, typically see that if for consistent workloads that are really hammering Bedrock constantly, you can do provision throughput. Another reason a customer may do provision throughput is if model customization was a requirement, provision throughput would need to be activated. In the future, depending on if there's an appetite for it, there also is a batch inference option. The prototype will use the on-demand consumption model because the idea is that we want to expedite the analysis of the reviews. But let's say as you offer your product to other customers and you want, maybe there's different tiers, for example. So maybe some of your customers are willing to wait for review analysis within a 24-hour period. You could get some savings there with the batch inference. Before we go into the architecture, really, I wanted to just summarize customer journey. We need to identify the business use case, which we've done. We'll work to choose the best model. As we think about productionizing this, we'll think about things such as responsible AI, customization, and integration of some of the tooling such as Bedrock agents. Cool, and now the moment we've all been waiting for, the proposed architecture. As mentioned earlier, in working with your data analyst, it's my understanding that you can easily export all the reviews from your various customer sites via JSON. So what's going to happen here is that we're going to establish an S3 bucket. That'll be like the intake, and that's where the JSON will be updated. And then we're going to have, this would be actually good if I put my annotation back on. So this is our S3 bucket here where we're ingesting this. We're going to have a Lambda function that is monitoring this S3 bucket. When these JSON documents are uploaded, it's going to trigger this Lambda function right here. Now, this Lambda function is going to have some Python code. We can look deeper into that on Friday. That's going to take that JSON. It's going to do some processing on it. It's going to form a prompt. It's going to send that to Bedrock, which is indicated here. And then after we get that response from Bedrock, we're going to persist the data we get back from that prompt in a DynamoDB table. And we're going to get things like what I call that executive summary review, which is the compilation of all the reviews that have been summarized together. We're going to get a sentiment breakdown of positive reviews, mixed reviews, negative reviews. We're going to get a list of actions that we can take to improve the product. And then we're going to get a score on how confident the model is on how it broke down the overall review, whether it's positive, mixed, or neutral on that product. Now down here on this bottom tier is a separate workflow. And what I've done here is I've created an event schedule in Amazon Event Bridge. And what this is going to do, right now it's configured to simply run every 24 hours at midnight UTC time. It's going to trigger a Lambda function, which is going to take the data within this DynamoDB table from the prior day of reviews that have been processed. It's going to generate a CSV file. It's going to persist that to an S3 bucket, which is where it will persist. And it will also send it via SNS to any email addresses that are subscribed to that particular topic to basically proactively send that analysis of reviews to someone via email. Ideally, this would be marketing or product management. And that's a quick summary of what we're going to be doing there for the architecture leading up to Friday. I'll pause there to see if we have any initial questions on the overall design. It depends on how you want to break it down. There's some flexibility there in terms of how you want to export your JSON information. You could do the whole history of all the reviews that you have and ingest those. You could ingest reviews for different products. The way I broke it down just for our prototype is I have a collection of reviews for different items, for example. They could be blenders, they could be mountain bikes. The products that I'm reviewing are at many different ends of the spectrum, given that any company is produced and the product that you produce is a SaaS product. They could be dental companies, mountain bike shop, a restaurant. So I just want to give you a collection of different products, so to speak, and how the model how it contends with all of it. So the data will be persisted to the DynamoDB database. So that call that it gets is it's essentially ephemeral, that call. But what makes it stick is when the Lambda function takes that return call from Bedrock and that prompt and persist it to DynamoDB. So that's where it'll live. Cool. And this will make probably a ton more sense on Friday as we go to it in depth. You'll see it working in action. And I'd like to spend some time on Friday. We have something called the AWS Well Architected Framework, which is 6 pillars: is security, cost, operations, reliability, performance, and sustainability. As I'm going through some of these layers, I'll highlight some of the things such as reliability and security and how we're able to achieve some of those things. Keep in mind, this is a prototype based on one person's effort, mine, built in a couple of days. But yeah, we can definitely work with your team after which to talk about ways of taking it to production. So just closing out here, the proof of concept is going to address analyzing business reviews for key insights. It's going to provide an executive review of products that we're uploading based on those reviews. It's going to have a full sentiment breakdown, as I mentioned earlier, and actions for actionable insights for the teams, whether it's marketing or product management, to be able to improve those products. How does Friday look in terms of me going over the proof of concept and the demo with you? All right. Sounds great. It was a pleasure meeting with you today, and look forward to demonstrating the proof of concept with you on Friday.